We'll start our consideration of the intersection of environment and development by exploring some of the common theoretical models that underscore human behavior and the environment. Specifically, we'll look at the tragedy of the commons and the role of game theory in understanding environmental economics. You'll recall from the first week of the class, we discussed Larry Summers' internal memo from 1991, in which he outlined the reasons to promote the migration of polluting industries from the first world to the third world. Summers' proposition was rooted in three assumptions about how to understand environmental problems in the context of development. These were the idea of opportunity costs and foregone earnings as the central measure of environmental impact, the nature of costs associated with air pollution, and the income elasticity of environmentalism. His reasoning, as Brazil's Environment Minister Jose Lutzenberger argued at the time, was perfectly reasonable but totally insane. Today, we'll look at game theory and the tragedy of the commons that underscore many of the economic approaches, including that of Summers, to understanding the environment. Before moving on to that question, though, it's important to briefly review the characteristics of goods, or commodities. All goods have two characteristics. Rivalry refers to the degree to which one person's use of a good undermines the ability of someone else to use that good at the same time. If I'm driving my car to San Francisco, someone else cannot simultaneously use my car to drive to Portland. If I'm using my computer to write a paper, someone else cannot use my computer to surf the internet at the same time. The use of both goods is rivalrous. Excludability refers to the possibility of preventing someone who is not paid for a good from benefiting from the use or consumption of that good. I can put a password on my computer or use a car key to prevent someone else from using those goods. Goods can exhibit a higher or lower degree of rivalry and a higher or lower degree of excludability. Most goods have high excludability and high rivalry. These are the commodities we tend to think of most often, things like a car or a television. Collectively, these are usually referred to as private goods. At the opposite end of the spectrum are goods which have low excludability and low rivalry. These are referred to as public goods and have historically been provided by the state. National defense generally falls into this category. Club goods have high excludability but low rivalry. These are goods like cable television. If I'm watching one station on my cable television, my neighbor can watch a different station at the same time. There is no rivalry, but it's possible to prevent someone who hasn't paid for cable television from watching it in the first place. But from the perspective of the environment, the most problematic goods are known as common pool goods. These are things like fisheries or fresh air. Here, rivalry exists. It's possible to deplete a fishery through overfishing or to pollute the air to a state where it's no longer healthy. But it's difficult to exclude people from the use of those resources, even if they decline to pay for them. The tragedy of the commons results from the characteristics of common pool goods. As Adam Smith famously described the nature of private goods and the role of the market and the invisible hand in the allocation of private resources, Smith, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, observed that man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. He will more likely prevail if he can show them that it is in their own advantage to do for him what he requires of them. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love. The invisible hand of the market is represented in this idea. But in the context of common pool goods, the same rational self-interest that promotes the invisible hand celebrated by Smith leads to a perverse outcome. The tension was most famously observed by Garrett Hayden in his 1968 article entitled The Tragedy of the Commons. In it, Hayden establishes the hypothetical common pasture in which each shepherd could place sheep, keeping all of the profits from those sheep, but bearing only a portion of the costs. Hayden argued that the rational decision for any individual shepherd was to continue to increase the number of sheep on the commons. As each shepherd did this, the commons were gradually overgrazed and destroyed. As Hardin put it, freedom in the commons brings ruin to all. As Hardin argued in his classic article, the rational herdsman concludes that the only sensible course for him to pursue is to add another animal to his herd, and another, and another. But this is the conclusion reached by each and every rational individual herdsman sharing in the commons. Therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a ruinous system that compels him to increase his herd without limit, in a world that is limited. Ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. From Hardin's perspective, the solution to the tragedy was to find a way to force individuals to internalize those costs that they might otherwise externalize to the commons. The easiest way to do this, Hardin contended, was to enclose the commons. In doing so, the individual shepherd would keep all the profits from their activities, but would also bear all the costs. This system would force them then to behave in a more sustainable way. The prisoner's dilemma helps us understand why environmental challenges emerge. The prisoner's dilemma assumes that individuals behave in a rational, self-interested way, but that structural constraints on individual behavior may incentivize particular outcomes. Specifically, the prisoner's dilemma posits that two members of a criminal gang, let's call them Bonnie and Clyde, are arrested and imprisoned. Each prisoner is in solitary confinement with no means of speaking to or exchanging messages with the other. The police admit that they don't have enough evidence to convict the pair on the main charge, but they can sentence both to a year in prison on a lesser charge. Simultaneously, the police offer each prisoner a choice. Testify against your partner and you will go free while your partner gets 3 years in prison on the main charge. But there's a catch. If both prisoners testify against each other, they'll both be sentenced to jail. Game theory suggests that the dominant strategy in this situation is to defect, that is, to cooperate with authorities and testify against your partner. But in doing so, both prisoners are worse off than they would have been had they remained silent. This is because I can never know for certain what my partner will do, and regardless of my partner's choice, I am always better off if I cooperate with the police. This point can be confusing, so let's look at my choices. Let's say I'm Clyde. I can never know what Bonnie will do since her choices here are labeled only A and B. My choice in each instance is whether I should talk or remain silent. Whether Bonnie chooses A or B, I am always better off if I talk. If she chooses A and I remain silent, I get 10 years, but if I talk, I get only 2. Similarly, if Bonnie chooses B and I remain silent, I get 1 year, but if I talk, I go free. Regardless of her choice, I'm better off by talking. This is what makes the prisoner's dilemma such an interesting phenomenon. The best individual strategy always leads to a Nash equilibrium, and a Nash equilibrium is a situation in which no player can do better off by unilaterally changing their choice. It leads to a Nash equilibrium that is Pareto's suboptimal, a situation in which someone can be made better off without making anyone else worse off. These are important ideas, so let's briefly review them. A Nash equilibrium, named for famous mathematician John Nash, exists in a situation in which no player can do better by unilaterally changing their choice. Simply stated, two players are in a Nash equilibrium if each is making the best decision they can, taking into account the other's decision. Pareto optimality, named for Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, is a situation in which no individual can be made better off without making someone else worse off. By contrast, Pareto's suboptimal outcomes are when one person can be made better off without making anyone else worse off. It should be clear that many of the contemporary environmental challenges we face have characteristics both of common pool resources and of a prisoner's dilemma. Consider, for example, the problem of greenhouse gas emissions. Well, we'll return to this question later in a later lecture. For now, let's consider why it's so difficult for countries to agree on binding greenhouse gas emission targets. Global climate change affects every country in the world, regardless of the degree to which they contribute to the problem. Similarly, preventing global catastrophic climate change is in the best interest of every country. But no country can be excluded from the benefits. As a result, individual countries behaving in a rational and self-interested manner will continue to pollute. The benefits of greenhouse gas emissions, defined as more economic activity at a lower cost, accrue to the individual country, while the costs of greenhouse gas emissions are shared by the global community. Even if every country wants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they would prefer that other countries continue to pay the cost to do so. The immediate benefit to any individual country, in other words, outweighs the longer-term benefits of curbing their emissions. But if every country behaves in this way, we are all collectively worse off. In this payoff matrix, I've rank ordered the choice preferences for country A. Country A's best choice would be to continue to pollute while country B stops. This way, country A gets the benefits of economic growth and avoids climate change. Conversely, its worst choice would be to pay the costs of cleaning up while others pollute. Note that, as with the previous example, regardless of the decision of other countries, I am always better off polluting. The Nash equilibrium results in Pareto's suboptimal outcomes. And there are many environmental dilemmas that fit this mold, ranging from the protection of biodiversity to the Earth's atmosphere and oceans. Fortunately, there are also solutions. While the solution of enclosure advocated by Hardin may not work at the level of the global commons, Hardin's other solution of mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, presents several options. Government regulation and subsidies can incentivize particular choices by changing the structure of the prisoner's dilemma. Green taxes and tradable rights can similarly affect behavior. We'll explore some of these as we look in specific at environmental challenges this week. But there are also limits. At the international level, addressing the problem of inequality while achieving a consensus position will be challenging. Similarly, in the policy arena, the will of national governments to enact required legislation and facilitate cooperation with other states without necessarily advancing their own economic position may be difficult. We'll explore some of these in greater detail later in the module.